The sun was a hammer, and the sky was its anvil. It beat down on the cracked, thirsty earth with a white-hot fury that bleached the color from everything it touched. The grass, what little of it survived, was the color of old bone, brittle and sharp. Dust, fine as flour, coated the world in a pale shroud, stirred into lazy, choking clouds by a wind that offered no relief. It was a hot, dry breath that scoured the land, whispering of drought and decay through the shivering leaves of the lone, skeletal cottonwood that stood guard by the dry creek bed. This was Jericho Kane's kingdom, a kingdom of dust and fences. He rode the line now, his body a familiar, easy weight in the saddle, his horse, a stoic gray named Asher, picking its way along the wire with the practiced indifference of an animal that knew its job better than the man on its back. The creak of saddle leather was a constant, rhythmic complaint, a sound so ingrained in the silence it had become a part of it, like the thrum of a man's own blood in his ears. Jericho was a large man, built on a scale that matched the vast, empty plains around him. His shoulders were wide enough to block out a good portion of the horizon, and his hands, resting heavy on the pommel, were calloused and scarred. Maps of a life lived through hard labor and harder fights. There was a stillness to him, a profound quiet that went deeper than a simple lack of words. It was in the set of his jaw, the hard line of his mouth, and the distant, unreadable light in his pale blue eyes. Those eyes, shielded beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat, missed nothing. They saw the way the buzzards circled high in the thermal currents, the flicker of a lizard's tail in the shadow of a rock, the subtle shift in the wind that meant the heat would only get worse before it got better. He had long ago stopped looking for goodness in the world. He looked for weakness, for rot, for the first sign of a fence post giving way to the unforgiving earth. He looked for the telltale tracks of a coyote or a wolf, for the sickness in a calf's eye, for the endless, tireless threats that this land threw at a man to test his will. Goodness was a luxury, a soft thing that couldn't survive out here. It got burned up by the sun, starved by the drought, and blown away by the wind. All that was left was what was hard, what was durable, what could endure. Like the wire he now checked, pulling off a gauntlet to test its tension, it sang a low, metallic note under his thumb, tight and true, for now. The only other sound in the vast emptiness was the groan of the windmill. It stood a quarter-mile off, near the ranch house, its metal blades turning in a slow, reluctant circle. Each rotation was accompanied by a weary, rhythmic squeal, a sound of metal complaining against metal, of a machine slowly grinding itself to dust. To some, it might have been the sound of life, of water being drawn from the deep, dark places of the earth. To Jericho, it was the sound of a long, slow death. It was the voice of the ranch itself, tired, broken, but still turning, just. His gaze swept the horizon, a habit as ingrained as breathing. East, where the land flattened into an endless brown sea. West, where the distant, hazy shapes of the mountains promised a coolness they never delivered. South, nothing but more of the same. And north, a smudge, a dark little disruption in the shimmering heat haze that danced above the plain. He stopped, his hand resting on Asher's neck, the horse's skin hot and damp beneath his palm. He watched. It was too slow for a rider, too small for a storm cloud. It moved with a lurching, uneven gait, a wagon, a single, rickety wagon, pulled by one tired-looking horse, crawling its way across his land. Visitors were rare, unwelcome. They brought news from a world he'd left behind, or they wanted something he didn't have to give. Water, work, help. He had little enough of any for himself and the handful of grim-faced men who worked for him. He watched the wagon's slow, agonizing progress, a frown cutting a deeper line between his brows. It followed the faint track that passed for a road, heading directly for his gate. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They were coming for him. He nudged Asher with his heels, the horse moving into a steady walk. paralleling the wagon's course from the other side of the fence. He stayed a few hundred yards distant, a silent, watching shadow. He could see it clearer now. The horse was a bay. Its head hung low with exhaustion, its ribs stark beneath its dusty hide. The wagon was a small, ramshackle affair, its canvas cover patched and torn, its wheels wobbling on their axles. It looked like it had traveled 1,000 miles and was ready to give up the ghost on the 1,001st. And the driver, he couldn't make out a face, just a slight figure, hunched against the sun. The smallness of the shape suggested a woman or a boy. He felt a familiar tightening in his gut, a sour mix of irritation and resignation. Trouble always came in a package you didn't expect. He reached the main gate before the wagon did, swinging down from Asher's back with a fluid grace that was surprising in a man his size. He looped the reins over the top rail and stood, waiting. His silence was a wall, his stance a declaration. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, his shadow stretching long and dark across the parched ground. The windmill kept up its mournful song behind him. The sun beat down, and the world held its breath. The clatter of the wagon grew louder, a pathetic, tinny sound in the immense quiet. The tired plod of the horse's hooves, the squeal of a wheel that needed grease, the gentle flapping of a loose piece of canvas. Finally, it lumbered to a halt just outside the gate. The dust it had kicked up swirled around it for a moment, then settled, revealing the driver. It was a woman. She was thin, with a wiry, starved kind of thinness that spoke of missed meals and long roads. Her dress was a faded calico, worn soft and frayed at the cuffs, but it was clean. Her hands, holding the cracked leather reins, were brown from the sun and rough with work, the knuckles bony. She pushed back the bonnet that had shadowed her face, and Jericho found himself looking into the clearest, most startling pair of gray eyes he had ever seen. They were the color of the sky just before a storm, and they were filled with a deep, weary caution. They were the eyes of a creature that had learned to expect a blow, to watch for the sudden movement that signaled danger. Yet, beneath the wariness, there was a spark, a flicker of something bright and unbroken. Her face was all sharp angles and hollows, her skin pulled tight over her cheekbones, tanned and weathered by sun and wind. She might have been pretty once, he supposed, in a delicate, bird-like way. Now, she just looked tired, tired all the way down to her bones. She didn't look at him directly at first. Her gaze flickered over the sturdy gate, the long, straight line of the fence, the stark shape of the ranch house in the distance, the windmill turning its endless, sorrowful circle. She was taking it all in, measuring it, assessing it. Then, her eyes finally met his. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment. She didn't flinch from the hardness she saw there. Her chin, small and pointed, lifted a fraction of an inch. When she spoke, her voice was low and raspy, roughened by dust but clear. "Heard you might need a cook." The silence that followed her words was as vast and heavy as the sky. The wind died down for a moment, and the only sound was the steady, complaining squeal of the windmill, a lonely metronome counting out the seconds. Jericho Kane did not move. His pale eyes stayed on her, flat and hard as river stones. He looked at her not as a man looks at a woman, but as he would look at a stray dog that had wandered onto his property, a potential problem, a source of disease, or at the very least, an unwelcome mouth to feed. Her hope, a small and fragile thing she had carried across miles of cracked earth, began to wither under that gaze. She could feel it curling up inside her, like a leaf in a fire. The wariness in her eyes sharpened. The faint spark he had noticed now shielded, hidden away in a place he could not reach. When he finally spoke, his voice was the sound of rocks grinding together, a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It was a voice that had been stripped of all warmth, all inflection, all humanity. It was the sound of finality. Heard wrong. The two words were not spoken loudly. but they landed with the force of a physical blow. They cut through the air and struck her, and she felt herself flinch. A tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders. The dust, which had been settling, seemed to hang in the air again, thick and suffocating. She swallowed, her throat painfully dry. She could turn the wagon around. She could face the endless, sun-hammered plains again, with a water barrel that was nearly empty and a horse that was one day's hard travel from collapsing. Or she could stay here, in the shadow of this mountain of a man, and beg. She chose to beg. Her pride was a luxury she had shed miles ago, somewhere back in the dust with the last of her food. "Please," she said, and the word came out as a broken whisper, a sound so small the wind almost carried it away. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing a sliver of strength into her voice. I don't need much, just a roof, a place out of this sun. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, mend, anything." Her gaze dropped from his face to the barren yard behind him, to the long, low bunkhouse where the hands would sleep, to the main house that looked as shuttered and forbidding as its owner. "Just for a bit of food and a place to lay my head. My horse is done in." As if on cue, the bay horse sighed, a great shuddering exhalation of breath that stirred the dust around its hooves. It did not have the strength to lift its head. It simply stood, a monument to exhaustion. Jericho's gaze followed hers, but his expression did not soften. Sympathy was a fool's game. He had seen dozens like her over the years. Drifters, grifters, people running from something or to something, all of them ending up here, at the edge of the world, thinking they could find a foothold. They were all the same. They brought their troubles with them like burrs on a blanket, and they always left a bigger mess than they'd found. He let his eyes travel over her again. Slowly, deliberately. It was a cold, methodical inventory, and she felt it like a physical touch, a violation that stripped her bare. He saw the way the faded calico of her dress hung on her thin frame, the hollows at the base of her throat. He saw the raw, chapped skin of her lips, cracked from sun and dehydration. He saw her hands, clenched, white-knuckled on the reins, the fingernails broken, the skin calloused and scarred. These were not the hands of a lady. They were the hands of someone who had scrabbled and clawed for every moment of her existence. He looked at her face, truly looked at it, past the dirt and the exhaustion. He saw the fine lines of fear and pain etched around her eyes and mouth, lines that had no business being on a face so young. He saw all of her history, all of her desperation, laid out before him under the unforgiving sun. He saw a creature that was cornered, hungry and desperate, and the part of him that had died long ago, the part that might have felt a stir of compassion, remained silent and still as a tombstone. What he felt instead was a cold, brutal pragmatism. A cook, his last one, a grumpy old man named Silas, had finally packed it in 2 weeks ago. Tired of the isolation and what he called the god-awful quiet. The hands had been complaining ever since, their bellies full of half-cooked beans and burnt bacon. A functioning ranch needed a cook. It was a simple, mechanical truth. This woman, this piece of human driftwood that had washed up at his gate, claimed she could fill that role. She looked like a strong wind could snap her in two, but he had seen that kind of wiry toughness before. Sometimes, it was the ones who looked the most fragile who were the hardest to break. He had to make a decision, let her in, and he was letting in the unknown. A whole world of trouble he couldn't see yet. Send her away, and he was sending her back out into the furnace of the plains. A sentence that was as good as death. He felt nothing about that possibility. The plains didn't care, and neither did he. It was the world's way. But the ranch needed a cook. He made his choice, but first, he would set the terms. He would draw the line so clearly, so brutally, that there could be no misunderstanding. There would be no appeals to his better nature, because he had none. There would be no quiet hopes for kindness, because he had none to give. He would cauterize the wound before it was even made. burn out any chance of infection from the softness she might carry inside her. He would give her a roof and food, and in return, she would work. That was the entire contract. Nothing more. He would make sure she understood that. He looked directly into her storm-gray eyes, letting her see the full depth of the emptiness inside him. He would use words as a weapon, as a branding iron, to mark the nature of their relationship from the very first moment. "You ain't worth loving," he said, his voice flat, devoid of malice, but filled with a chilling conviction. It was a simple statement of fact, as he saw it, a truth about her, about him, about the entire damned world. Just cook. The words hung in the air between them, shimmering in the heat. They were more cruel than a slap, more wounding than a fist. They were a judgment, a dismissal of her entire being, reducing her to a single, simple function. Lark felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. Her vision blurred for a second, the hard lines of the man and the fence and the house dissolving into a watery haze. It was as if he had reached inside her chest and squeezed her heart until it went still. Every harsh word she had ever heard, every cold shoulder, every moment of casual cruelty she had endured on her long journey, it was all nothing compared to this. This was a deeper kind of wound. He hadn't just insulted her, he had erased her. He had looked at the sum of her life, her pain, her struggle to simply exist, and declared it worthless. For a long moment, she could not speak. She could only feel the truth of his words sinking into her, a cold, heavy stone dropping into the well of her soul. He was right, wasn't he? If she had been worth loving, she wouldn't be here, alone, begging a stranger for scraps. If she had been worth loving, her life would look different. His words were just an echo of a secret fear she had carried within herself for years. She felt the last of her fight drain out of her, leaving her hollow and empty. There was nothing left but the raw, animal need to survive, to get out of the sun, to drink a cup of clean water, to sleep in a place where she didn't have to listen for footsteps in the dark. She lowered her head, her bonnet shadowing her face once more. It was a gesture of complete and utter surrender. The proud lift of her chin was gone. Her shoulders, which she had held so straight, now slumped forward in defeat. When she finally answered, her voice was a ghost, a thread of sound so thin it was barely audible above the ceaseless moan of the windmill. "I'll take it." Jericho gave a single, sharp nod. He turned his back on her then, the conversation over, the contract sealed. He strode to the gate and with an economy of movement, lifted the heavy wooden latch. The gate swung inward with a groan. He didn't look back at her. He didn't motion her forward. He simply walked toward his horse, his boots crunching on the dry, unforgiving ground. He swung himself up into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. He did not know, and would not have cared, that his words had just carved a fresh wound onto a soul already riddled with scars. He did not see it as cruelty. He saw it as clarity. He had drawn a line in the dust, and now she knew exactly where she stood. On the other side of it, he nudged Asher with his heel and rode toward the barn, not once looking back to see if the woman in the rickety wagon had found the strength to drive through the open gate. The room was attached to the back of the main house, accessible through a short, covered breezeway that did little to stop the dust from piling in the corners. It was designated as the kitchen, but it felt more like a forgotten shed. When Lark Donovan pushed the warped wooden door open, it groaned in protest, scraping a semicircle into the floorboards. The air inside was still and cool, holding the faint, ghost-like smells of meals past stale grease, scorched coffee, and the dry, musty scent of sacked flour. It was a small, cramped space, a massive, cast-iron stove, black and formidable, dominated one wall, its surface coated in a thin layer of rust-colored dust. A long, scarred wooden table stood in the center of the room, its surface a testament to years of sharp knives, hot pans, and the elbows of tired men. The wood was gouged and stained, a map of 1,000 hasty meals. Along the far wall, a set of rough-hewn shelves held a motley collection of dented tin plates, heavy ceramic mugs, and a few glass jars containing the staples of this hard-land pinto beans, pale and patient, dried corn, and a half-empty sack of salt. This was her new world. Not the vast, sun-blasted horizon, but these four walls. This was the boundary of the life she had just accepted. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her small bag clutched in her hand, and simply took it all in. There was no welcome here, no comfort. The room was as brutally functional and devoid of warmth as the man who owned it. It was a place for work, nothing more. And that, she thought with a strange, hollow clarity, was exactly what she was now, a tool to be used in this room. She set her bag down in a corner, out of the way, and untied the strings of her bonnet. Methodically, she hung it on a nail by the door, an act of claiming, however small. Then she rolled up the sleeves of her worn calico dress and began to work. She started with the stove. It was a beast, cold and silent. She opened its iron belly and swept out the old ashes, her movements efficient and practiced. She found the kindling box, nearly empty, and the wood pile out back, a haphazard stack of mesquite and cottonwood. She made 3 trips, her thin arms laden with wood, her face set in a mask of concentration. She laid the fire with an expert hand, a small pyramid of tinder and kindling that caught the first spark from the flint and steel with a satisfying, hungry whoosh, as the stove began to breathe a slow, radiating heat into the room. She turned her attention to the rest of the kitchen. She found a pail and a stiff-bristled brush and hauled water from the pump in the yard, its handle squealing in protest with every pull, just like the windmill. She scrubbed the long wooden table until the pale grain of the wood began to show through the years of grime. She washed every plate, every mug, every fork and spoon, using a harsh lye soap that stung her hands. She organized the shelves, wiping down the jars, taking inventory of the meager supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, cornmeal, lard. It was a monotonous, uninspiring list, but it was food. It was survival. By late afternoon, the kitchen was transformed. It was still a poor, rough space, but it was clean. The floor was swept, the surfaces scrubbed. A pot of beans was simmering on the back of the stove, sending a savory, earthy steam into the air, and a large coffee pot was beginning to hiss, its aroma rich and strong, not burnt, finally chasing away the last of the old, stale smells. Lark worked in a bubble of silence, her movements economical and purposeful. She did not hum or sing. Her focus was absolute. This was her work. This was her worth. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, she heard them. The sound of tired boots on the hard-packed earth, the low murmur of men's voices, the jingle of spurs. The ranch hands were coming in from the fields. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. These were the men she had to feed. These were the other inhabitants of her new, silent world. They filed in not through the kitchen door, but into the adjoining mess hall, a long room with 2 more of the same scarred tables and rough benches. Lark began to carry the food in the heavy pot of beans, a skillet of freshly baked cornbread, golden and steaming, and the big metal coffee pot. There were 5 of them, not counting Cain. They were cut from the same cloth as the land itself weathered, lean and hard. Their faces were burned brown by the sun. Their hands were calloused and cracked, and their eyes were narrowed against the perpetual glare. They moved with a bone-deep weariness, slumping onto the benches without a word. When they saw her, they paused, their forks, halfway to the pot of beans, stopped in midair. They looked at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and blunt curiosity. Their gazes were not unkind, not threatening, but they were deeply unsettling. They were the looks of men who were not used to seeing a woman in this place, especially not one so thin and worn. They looked her over from head to toe, their eyes lingering for a moment on her face before dropping to the food she had set out. No one spoke. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the scrape of a bench as the last man sat down. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, they began to eat. The only sounds were the clatter of tin plates, the scrape of forks, and the guttural sounds of hungry men eating. They ate with a grim, focused efficiency, shoveling beans and cornbread into their mouths as if they feared it might be taken away. They did not talk to each other, and they did not talk to her. Lark stood by the doorway to the kitchen, her hands clasped in front of her, watching them. She felt invisible, like a piece of the furniture, her only purpose to fill the pots and pans that they were now so diligently emptying. When they were finished, they rose as one. Each man brought his plate to a wash basin by the door, scraping the last of the food into a bucket for the hogs. One of them, an older man with a gray-shot beard and kind, tired eyes, glanced at her as he passed. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a thank you. Not really. It was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that the food had been edible, that she had fulfilled her function. It was the most human interaction she had experienced all day. Then they were gone, melting back into the twilight, leaving behind the smell of sweat and dust and the wreckage of a meal. Later, after she had cleaned the last pot and banked the fire in the stove for the night, Jericho Kane finally showed her to her room. He didn't speak. He simply jerked his head toward a narrow door at the back of the kitchen. It was little more than a closet, a narrow cot with a thin, lumpy mattress and a single, rough wool blanket was pushed against one wall, a small, unadorned window, little more than a square cut out of the wall, looked out onto the vast, dark plains. There was a wooden crate upended to serve as a table, and a single nail on the wall for her things. That was all. "This is it," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement. She simply nodded. "It's fine." He looked at her for a moment, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering lamplight from the kitchen. Then he turned and left, closing the kitchen door behind him, plunging her tiny room into absolute darkness. Lark did not light a candle. She sat on the edge of the cot, the lumpy mattress protesting under her slight weight. She could feel the cool night air seeping in through the cracks in the walls. And she could hear the wind. Out here, the wind was a living thing. It was not the gentle breeze of other places. It was a vast, mournful sigh that swept across the plains, whispering through the dry grass, rattling the window frame, pressing against the thin wooden walls of the house. It was the sound of utter loneliness. She lay down, pulling the scratchy blanket up to her chin. She did not cry. Tears were a waste of water. She just lay there, stiff and straight in the darkness, and listened. She listened to the wind and to the frantic beating of her own heart. She was safe. For now. She had a roof over her head. She had earned her keep for one more day. That was all that mattered. She didn't know how long she lay awake, suspended in the dark, listening to the symphony of the empty night. What she did not know, what she could not see, was that she was not entirely alone. Far out in the yard, a single point of light moved through the darkness. It was the soft, golden glow of a kerosene lantern, bobbing gently in the night. Jericho Kane was making his rounds. It was a nightly ritual, a habit born of years of vigilance. He checked the latches on the corral, the doors to the barn, the water level in the trough. His boots made no sound on the soft dust. He moved like a phantom through the empire he had built, his face set in its perpetual, grim lines. His patrol always ended with a slow circle of the main house. As he passed the back, his gaze fell upon the small, dark square that was her window. He stopped, his boots sinking slightly into the dust, the lantern held low by his side. He stood there for a long time, a silent, hulking shadow in the immense, star-dusted dark. He looked at the black rectangle of her window, seeing nothing, hearing nothing but the eternal, restless wind. His expression did not change. His thoughts remained his own, locked away behind his pale, watchful eyes. The lantern in his hand cast a small, lonely pool of light on the ground around him, a tiny, man-made star in the vast, indifferent darkness of the prairie. Then he turned and continued on his way, his light dwindling until it was just a pinprick, a firefly in the deep, and then it was gone. Sleep did not come. For Lark, sleep was not a gentle descent into rest, but a fortress that had to be stormed. And tonight, its walls were too high. She lay on the narrow cot, her body aching with a weariness that went far beyond the physical. It was a soul-deep exhaustion, yet her mind was a hive of frantic, buzzing activity. Every nerve was stretched taut, a string on a fiddle tuned to the key of fear. The darkness in the small room was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed in on her from all sides. It was not an empty dark. It was filled with sounds. The house, old and built of dry wood, seemed to be alive. It settled on its foundations with a chorus of groans and creaks, each sound a potential footstep, a hand on a latch. The ever-present wind was the conductor of this unnerving orchestra. It moaned around the corners of the house, a low, desolate sound that spoke of endless, empty miles. It found every crack and nail-hole, whistling and whispering secrets she couldn't quite decipher but knew she didn't want to hear. It made the ill-fitting window frame rattle with a sudden, sharp clatter that sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She lay perfectly still, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the rough wool of the blanket a harsh reality against her skin. She forced her breathing into a slow, shallow rhythm, straining to listen past the noise of her own blood pounding in her ears. This was a familiar state of being. She had spent countless nights just like this, cataloging the sounds of the dark, her body rigid with a terror that was as constant and reliable as the rising of the sun. Fear had been her companion for so long that its absence felt unnatural. A quiet night, a peaceful sleep, these were luxuries for other people, for a life she could barely remember, if it had ever existed at all. Her mind, a traitorous thing, began to play its old games. It took the innocent sigh of the wind and twisted it into the sound of a man's low, drunken murmur outside her door. The scrape of a branch against the roof became the sound of fingernails dragging along wood. These were phantoms. She knew, tricks of an exhausted and terrified mind. But knowing they were phantoms did not rob them of their power. Her past was not a memory. It was a ghost that lived inside her skin. And the darkness was when it chose to walk. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images came anyway. Not clear pictures, but flashes of sensation, the overpowering smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed clothes, the feeling of a hand gripping her arm too tightly, the sharp, stinging pain that followed a careless word. She felt a phantom ache bloom across her ribs, a memory of a hurt so deep it had settled into her bones. She pushed it all down, strangling the memories before they could fully form. A lifetime of practice behind the effort. Control, stillness, silence. That was how you survived. You made yourself small. You made yourself quiet. You became a thing that was not worth noticing. And then she heard it. It was different from the random, chaotic sounds of the night. This was a sound with purpose, with weight. It was the distinct, rhythmic crunch of a heavy boot on the dry, gravelly earth just outside her window. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Her heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm, seemed to stop altogether. The blood froze in her veins. She held her breath, her lungs burning, absolutely certain that the sound of her own breathing would give her away. The world narrowed to that single, terrifying sound. It was a slow, deliberate pace, a prowling pace, the sound of a predator. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling, it was a man. The footsteps drew closer, each one a hammer blow against her sanity. They stopped directly outside her window. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the noise had been. She could feel him there, just on the other side of the thin wooden wall. She imagined him standing in the dark, listening, just as she was. Could he hear her? Could he hear the frantic, terrified drumming of her heart? She was certain he could, was certain. Her body was paralyzed, locked in a state of pure, animal terror. Her muscles were screaming with the need to flee, to bolt, to run until her lungs burst, but she couldn't move. She was a rabbit in the shadow of a hawk, frozen by a fear too profound for action. All she could do was lie there, rigid in the oppressive dark, and wait for the hand on the latch, for the door to splinter inward, for the phantom to become flesh. Outside, in the cool, dry air of the night, Jericho Kane stood motionless, the lantern in his hand extinguished, its warm metal a familiar weight against his leg. He was bathed in the pale, ghostly light of a million distant stars. His rounds had brought him here, to the back of the house, as they always did. It was a mindless, mechanical habit, but his senses were never dull. He was always listening, always watching. He had heard the wind carry the lonely call of a coyote from the distant hills. He had seen the silent flicker of heat lightning on the far horizon. And he had heard the sudden, sharp rattle of the window frame in the cook's new room. That was what had made him stop. It wasn't the sound itself. The old house was full of such noises. It was the silence that followed. A deep, profound, listening silence. It was a silence that felt heavy, unnatural. He stood there, his head cocked slightly, and listened with an intensity that few men possessed. He listened for the sound of quiet breathing, the rustle of a blanket as a sleeper shifted on a cot. He heard nothing. It was as if the room on the other side of the wall was not just empty, but holding its breath. He knew fear when he sensed it. He had seen it in the eyes of a horse cornered by a wolf, in the frantic, desperate struggle of a calf caught in a barbed wire fence. It had a smell, a taste, a presence in the air, and he could feel it now, radiating from that small, dark room. It was a silent, screaming thing. His first instinct, born of a lifetime of solving problems with direct, physical action, was to investigate, to rap his knuckles on the door, to call out a sharp, questioning, "Everything all right in there?" It was what a man was supposed to do, wasn't it? To check on the welfare of those under his roof. But he stopped himself. His hand, which had started to move toward the wall, fell back to his side. A cold, hard wall slammed down inside his mind. This was not his business. He had offered her a job, a roof, a measure of protection from the elements. He had not offered her comfort. He had not offered her solace. He had drawn the line himself, with his own cruel, calculated words. "You ain't worth loving. Just cook." Kindness now would be a lie. It would be a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed around himself, a chink that would let the light in, and he had no use for light. What if she screamed? What if she was in some kind of trouble? He dismissed the thought. There was no one out here for miles. The hands were asleep in the bunkhouse. The threat, he knew with a gut-level certainty, was not outside her door. It was inside, with her. She had brought her ghosts with her, packed them in that small bag alongside her worn-out dress. They were her demons to fight, not his. To interfere would be to invite connection. To ask what was wrong would be to accept a measure of responsibility for the answer. It would mean taking on her trouble, her history, her fear, and his own life was already too full of ghosts. He had no room for hers. So he stood there, a silent guardian in the dark, and did nothing. He was protecting his property, the perimeter of his land. He would kill any man or beast that tried to cross his fence line with ill intent. But he would not, could not, cross the line he had drawn himself between his world and the small, terrified world of the woman in that room. He was a watchman, not a savior. He turned, his boots making a soft, deliberate crunch in the dirt as he moved away. Inside, the sound of the retreating footsteps was the signal for Lark's lungs to finally, blessedly, release the breath she had been holding. It came out in a long, shuddering gasp. She did not relax. The terror did not recede. It simply changed its shape. The immediate, heart-stopping threat was gone, but the knowledge that someone had been there, just outside her window, remained. The night was no longer just empty and lonely. It was watchful. She lay awake for the rest of the night, her eyes wide open, staring into a darkness that would not yield. Every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind, was a new threat. Sleep was an impossible dream. She was adrift on a dark, terrifying sea, and the dawn was a shore she wasn't sure she would ever reach. And in the main house, in his own stark and lonely room, Jericho Kane also lay awake. He lay on his back, his hands behind his head, and stared at the familiar patterns of moonlight on his ceiling. He listened to the sounds of the night, the same sounds the woman in the kitchen was listening to, but he heard them differently. He did not hear menace or malice. He heard the familiar, predictable language of his world. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, another sound had been added to the chorus, the sound of a silent, suffocating fear, and the unsettling echo of his own decision to turn his back on it. The long, dark night stretched on. Two souls in the same house, separated by a wall and a world of pain. Both lay awake, keeping a lonely vigil until the first pale light of morning. One watching out of fear, the other out of a duty he refused to name. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, measured out by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. Lark Donovan's life found a new rhythm, one dictated by the needs of the stove, the clatter of plates, and the appetites of silent, hungry men. She rose before the sun, its first pale light finding her already grinding coffee or kneading dough. She worked until long after it had set. The soft glow of a kerosene lantern, her only companion as she scrubbed the last of the pots and swept the floor clean of the day's dust. She moved through her tasks with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency, becoming as much a fixture of the ranch as the moaning windmill or the stoic, sun-bleached fence posts. She spoke little and was spoken to even less. The ranch hands continued to treat her with a kind of weary, incurious distance. They were not unkind, but they were walled off, each man living in his own private world of dust and exhaustion. They took the food she prepared as a simple fact of their existence, like the rising of the sun or the ache in their backs. And Jericho Kane, he was a shadow, a presence she felt more than saw. He was there in the sharp, commanding tone of his voice carrying across the yard, in the heavy, solid sound of his boots on the porch, in the way the other men seemed to shrink in on themselves when he was near. He never spoke to her beyond a curt nod or a single-word instruction. The brutal contract he had laid out on her first day remained the law of the land. She was the cook. That was all. And yet, slowly, imperceptibly, a change was taking place. The constant, hyper-vigilant fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede. It did not disappear, but its sharp edges began to dull. The nights were still long and filled with the lonely sounds of the prairie, but she no longer lay frozen in terror, listening for a footstep that never came, the rhythm of the work. The sheer, bone-deep exhaustion at the end of each day was a strange kind of medicine. It left no room in her mind for ghosts. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was simply too tired to be afraid. One evening, long after the men had eaten and retreated to the bunkhouse, Lark decided to do her laundry. The task had been put off for too long, and she could not abide being unclean. She carried a bucket of water, heated on the stove, out to the small, three-walled lean-to that served as the wash house. The air was cool and blessedly still, the wind having finally died down to a soft whisper. A sliver of moon hung in the vast, velvet-black sky, and the stars were scattered like diamond dust, so bright and clear they seemed close enough to touch. She lit a single lantern, its golden light pushing back the shadows, creating a small, intimate circle of warmth and visibility in the immense darkness. The light caught the steam rising from the hot water. the rough texture of the wooden washboard, the pale sliver of lye soap in her hand. The sounds were soft, muted the gentle chirp of crickets, the slosh and splash of water in the basin, the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of her knuckles pushing the worn fabric of her dress against the washboard. It was a peaceful, solitary moment, here, in this little bubble of light. She felt a sense of privacy she never had during the day. She was not the cook. She was not the frightened woman who had arrived at the gate. She was just Lark, a woman washing her clothes under the stars, unthinking, lost in the simple, repetitive motion of the work. She pushed the sleeves of her dress high up her arms, baring them to the cool night air. She did not hear him approach. His footsteps, always heavy during the day, were silent in the soft dust of the yard. She was only aware of his presence when a shadow fell across the wash basin, momentarily eclipsing the lantern light. She gasped, a small, sharp intake of breath, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around, her wet hands held up in a useless, defensive gesture. Jericho Kane stood at the edge of the light, his large frame seeming to soak up the darkness around him. In one hand, he held a long hunting knife, and in the other, a whetstone. He had evidently been on his way to the porch to sharpen the blade, another of his silent, nightly rituals. He had stopped when he saw the light. He said nothing. His face was half in shadow, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were fixed, not on her face, but on her arm. Lark followed his gaze. She looked down and saw what he was seeing, illuminated in the stark, unforgiving light of the lantern. High on her left forearm, just below the crook of her elbow, was a bruise. It was old, the angry purples and blacks of the initial injury having long since faded into a sickly, mottled canvas of pale violet and jaundiced yellow. It was the ghost of a hurt, a faint, ugly stain against the paleness of her skin, a map of a pain that had not been inflicted by the sun or the hard work of the ranch. Instinct, sharp and swift as a striking snake, took over. She yanked her sleeve down, the wet fabric clinging unpleasantly to her skin, her face flushed with a hot, terrible shame. The bruise was a mark of her past, a brand of weakness and failure that she kept hidden. For him to see it felt like a violation, a stripping away of the one thing she had left, the quiet, anonymous dignity of her labor. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sound was the frantic thrumming of her own pulse. She expected him to turn and walk away, to ignore what he had seen, or worse, to make a comment, a cold, cutting remark about her being trouble, just as he had suspected. But he did neither. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering. The scraping sound of her washing had stopped. Now, another sound ceased, the rhythmic, grating whisper of stone on steel. He had stopped sharpening his knife. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the harsh, gravelly instrument she was used to. It was low, quiet, a strange, rough sound in the still night air. "Someone do that to you?" The question was simple, direct. It held no judgment, no accusation, but it struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever looked at one of her marks and acknowledged it as something that had been done to her by another person. They were just a part of her, a part of the landscape of her life that people had either ignored or taken for granted. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and unwelcome. She fought them back fiercely. Crying in front of this man was an indulgence she could not afford. She stared at the ground, at the dark, damp patch of earth where the water had splashed. Unable to meet his eyes, what could she say? How could she explain a lifetime of such hurts to a man made of stone and iron? "Does it matter?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question, born of a deep and weary resignation. The world had taught her, again and again, that her pain did not matter. It was a private currency, to be born in silence and spent on nothing. Jericho looked at the top of her bowed head, at the slender, vulnerable line of her neck. He looked at the sleeves she had pulled down, as if the thin, damp cloth could hide the history written on her skin. He thought of his own scars, the ones on his hands and the deeper ones that no one could see. He thought of the hard, brutal lessons the world had taught him, the first and most important of which was to never show a weakness. This woman was covered in them, and yet she was still standing, still working, still breathing. A feeling he had not felt in a decade, something he had thought long dead and buried, stirred in the cold, barren ground of his heart. It was a foreign, unwelcome sensation, but it was undeniably there. It was a dull ache, a ghost of an emotion that might once have been called compassion. "It matters enough," he said, his voice still low and rough. He turned then, without another word, and walked away, the knife and the stone hanging limp in his hands. He did not go to the porch to finish his work. He disappeared back into the shadows from which he had come, leaving her alone in her small, trembling circle of light. Lark stood frozen for a long time, the water growing cold in the basin, the soap melting in her hand. "It matters enough." The 3 words echoed in the quiet of the night. It was not a promise. It was not an offer of help. It was just a statement, a simple acknowledgement, and it was more than anyone had given her in years. The next morning, when she entered the kitchen before dawn, she noticed it immediately. The silence, the heavy wooden door, which for weeks had protested her every entrance and exit with a loud, grating groan, now swung inward without a sound. She pushed it back and forth a few times, marveling at the change. Someone had taken the time to oil the rusty hinges. Later, as she reached for the sack of flour on the shelf, her fingers brushed against something small and cool. It was a small, round tin, dark and unmarked. She opened it. Inside was a thick greenish-yellow salve, smelling faintly of herbs and pine. It was the kind of ointment used for bruises and sore muscles, a staple in any place where men and animals lived hard lives. It had not been there the night before. She stood in the middle of the quiet kitchen, the small tin resting in the palm of her hand. There were no words, no explanations, none were needed. The silent door and the anonymous gift spoke a language clearer than any words he had ever spoken to her. They were a hinge being oiled, a balm being offered, a quiet, unspoken answer to a question she had been too afraid to even ask. "It matters enough." She closed the tin, her fingers trembling slightly, and placed it carefully on the shelf where she could find it later. Then she turned to the stove and began to make the morning coffee, moving through a silence that, for the first time, did not feel empty. The need for supplies was what finally broke the seal on Jericho Kane's isolated kingdom. A ranch, no matter how self-sufficient, could not produce its own coffee, salt, or flour. And so, once a month, a wagon made the slow, jarring journey to the town of Redemption. It was a journey Lark had been dreading since the moment she'd learned of it. The ranch, for all its harshness and silence, had become a sanctuary of sorts. It was a known quantity, a predictable world of hard work and solitude. The town was the unknown, a place filled with people, and people were always more dangerous than the wind or the sun. But the flour bin was nearly empty and the coffee was down to its last scoop, so the journey had to be made. Jericho did not ask her if she wanted to go. He simply informed her, "We leave for Redemption at sunrise. Have a list ready." His tone made it clear that her presence was a matter of utility. She knew the kitchen's needs better than anyone. The town of Redemption was a scar on the face of the prairie. It was a single, wide street, churned into a perpetual state of dust or mud depending on the season, flanked by a row of ramshackle, false-fronted buildings that leaned against each other for support. It was a town born of desperation and expediency, a place for cowboys to spend their pay on cheap whiskey and for ranchers to buy the necessities that kept their worlds turning. As their wagon rolled down the main street, Lark felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. She sat on the wagon bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her back ramrod straight. The noise was a physical assault after the profound quiet of the plains. A tinny, out-of-tune piano clanked from the saloon, punctuated by a sudden burst of loud, male laughter. Horses whinnied and stamped at the hitching posts, and the air was thick with the smells of manure, sawdust, frying meat, and a cloying, sweet perfume that drifted from the saloon's swinging doors. She felt exposed, a pale, quiet bird in a cage full of loud, brightly colored parrots. Jericho pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Miller's Mercantile, the largest and most respectable establishment in town. He swung down from the bench, his movements economical and sure. "Get what you need," he said, his gaze sweeping the street, his expression as hard and unreadable as ever. "I've got business at the blacksmith's. Don't wander." It was an order, not a suggestion. Lark slid down from the wagon, her worn boots sinking into the thick dust. She clutched her list, the paper a small, reassuring anchor in this chaotic new sea. The Mercantile was a cavern of wonders and shadows, smelling richly of leather, molasses, and raw textiles. Sacks of grain were piled high. Barrels of pickles and crackers stood open, and shelves groaned under the weight of tinned goods, bolts of cloth, tools, and household necessities. She moved through the aisles, her focus narrowed to the items on her list: flour, coffee, salt, sugar, a new box of candles. She tried to make herself small, to move without drawing attention, but it was impossible. She was new, and in a town like Redemption, newness was a spectacle. She could feel the stares of the other women in the store, their eyes raking over her simple, mended dress and the weary lines on her face. She heard their whispers, sharp and sibilant as snakes in the grass. It was by the bolts of calico that she was cornered. A woman with hair the color of a brass spittoon, piled high on her head, and a dress of startlingly bright purple stepped directly into her path. She had a hard, painted face and eyes that missed nothing. Behind her, two other women stood, their expressions a mixture of smugness and avid curiosity. "Well now, look what the cat dragged in," the woman in purple said, her voice loud enough for half the store to hear. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Ruby Belmont." Lark simply nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "Ma'am." She tried to step around her, but Ruby shifted, blocking her way again. "You're the one staying out at the Kane place, ain't you?" Ruby's eyes narrowed, taking in Lark's thin frame with a look that was part pity, part contempt. "Heard he got himself a new cook. Though from the looks of you, I'd say you're the one who needs a square meal." Her friends tittered behind her. Lark's face burned with a hot, prickling shame. She stared at a spot on the floorboards, praying for the woman to lose interest and move on. "Don't be shy now." Ruby pressed on, clearly enjoying her audience. She leaned in closer, her cheap perfume washing over Lark in a sickening wave. It must be something, living out there with that man. Silent as the grave and twice as mean, they say. I suppose a beggar can't be a chooser. She looked Lark up and down one last time and delivered her final, killing blow, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Still, it's awfully charitable of him, taking you in like that. Kane's new charity case." The word struck Lark with the force of a physical slap. Charity case. The phrase echoed in the sudden silence of the store. It stripped her of the one thing she had managed to build for herself at the ranch, a sense of purpose, of worth. Ruby's words painted her as a pathetic stray, a creature dependent on the pity of a hard man, not a worker earning her keep. It confirmed the worst of her own secret fears about herself. Lark did not respond. She did not defend herself. She had learned long ago that to struggle against such words was to give them more power. She simply stood there, silent and still, and took it. She let the shame wash over her, a cold, dirty tide, and waited for it to recede. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Ruby, bored by her lack of reaction, sniffed disdainfully, and swept away, her friends trailing in her wake like pilot fish. Lark finished her purchases in a numb daze, her hands trembling as she counted out the coins Jericho had given her. She fled the store, her head down, and practically ran to the wagon, hoisting the heavy sacks of flour and sugar over the side with a strength born of desperation. She did not know that across the street, leaning against the shadowed doorway of the blacksmith's forge, Jericho had seen the entire exchange. He had been watching her from the moment she stepped into the mercantile. He had seen Ruby Belmont and her cronies move in on her. He could not hear the words, but he didn't need to. He could read the story in the smug, cruel set of Ruby's shoulders and, more importantly, in the way Lark had seemed to shrink, to fold in on herself. The faint spark of life he had begun to see in her extinguished as if by a sudden gust of wind, a cold, quiet anger, an emotion as familiar to him as the feel of a saddle leather, settled deep in his gut. He said nothing. He did nothing. He just watched, his jaw tight, his eyes like chips of ice. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent ordeal. The sun beat down, the wagon wheels groaned, and the vast, empty landscape stretched out around them. The silence was different this time. Before, it had been a neutral thing, a simple absence of sound. Now, it was filled with the ugly echoes of Ruby Belmont's words. That evening, the kitchen was Lark's only refuge. The familiar smells of wood smoke and baking bread. The solid, dependable heat of the stove, these were her comforts. After she had cleaned up from the evening meal, she set about the task of storing the new supplies. She carefully emptied the new sacks of flour into the large wooden bin, and when she was done, she began the methodical, calming task of folding the empty burlap sacks into neat, compact squares. Her hands moved automatically, folding and creasing, folding and creasing, the repetitive motion a small anchor against the turmoil in her mind. The door opened without a sound. She was still not used to the silent hinges, and Jericho Kane stepped inside. He filled the doorway, his presence immediately shrinking the small room. He held a lantern, its warm, yellow light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Lark's hand stilled on the burlap sack. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She expected a reprimand. She had caused a scene in town, drawn attention to herself, and by extension, to him. He was a man who valued his privacy, his isolation, above all else. She braced herself for the anger, for the cold dismissal. He walked over to the central table and set the lantern down. Its light fell between them, illuminating the fine dusting of flour on her hands and the deep, weary lines etched on his face. He didn't look at her at first. His gaze was fixed on the neatly folded sacks. The silence grew, stretching her nerves to the breaking point. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the soft hiss of the lantern. "You cook good." The words were so unexpected. She wasn't sure she had heard him right. She looked up, her eyes wide and questioning. He was looking at her now, his gaze direct and steady. There was no anger in his eyes, no judgment. He continued, his voice still a low rumble. "Don't let him talk get to you." And there it was. He had seen, he had understood. He wasn't going to punish her. He was, in his own rough, spare way, trying to comfort her. He was directly refuting Ruby's words. She had called Lark a charity case, a worthless mouth to feed. Jericho was telling her that she was not. She was a good cook. She had value. She earned her place. He was rebuilding the dignity that had been stolen from her with a few simple, declarative words. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It was gratitude, sharp and overwhelming. She opened her mouth to say something, to explain, to apologize, but no words came. What could she possibly say? All she could manage was a choked whisper. "Thank you." He gave a single, curt nod, as if her thanks made him uncomfortable. The lantern on the table hissed softly, its light flickering across their faces, in that small, quiet kitchen. surrounded by the vast, dark emptiness of the prairie. Something profound and unspoken passed between them. The harsh, brutal contract of master and servant, of owner and functionary, had been irrevocably altered. A new clause had been written, not in ink, but in the shared language of a quiet, protective gesture and a whispered, grateful reply. He was no longer just the rancher, and she was no longer just the cook. They were two lonely people, standing together in a small circle of light, holding back the dark. A new kind of silence settled over the Kane Ranch. The old silence had been an absence, a void defined by unspoken pain and the vast, empty landscape. This new silence was different. It was a comfortable weight, a shared space that no longer needed to be filled with words. It was the quiet understanding between two people who were slowly, cautiously, learning the shape of each other's solitude. The change in Lark was subtle, like the first hint of green after a long winter. It began with the fear receding from her eyes. The constant, hunted look was replaced by a quiet watchfulness, and then, eventually, by a simple awareness of the world around her. She started to notice the way the morning light slanted across the kitchen floor, the intricate patterns of a spider's web in the corner of her window, the different calls of the birds that lived in the lone cottonwood tree. And then, one afternoon, as she watched one of the ranch hands, a young, clumsy boy named Silas, trip over his own feet and send a bucket of water flying, a small, unfamiliar sensation bubbled up inside her. It was a smile. It was a tiny, fleeting thing, barely a twitch at the corners of her mouth, and she quickly smothered it, her hand flying to her lips as if to hide the evidence. But the moment had happened. A seed of lightness had found a crack in the hard, barren ground of her soul and had begun to sprout. Jericho saw it. He was crossing the yard, his face set in its usual grim lines, and he saw the brief, ghost-like smile flit across her face. He said nothing. He gave no sign that he had noticed, but the image of it stayed with him, a strange, bright spot in the gray landscape of his day. A few mornings later, he found her by the corral, wistfully watching the horses mill about in the early light. She was holding out a handful of grass to an old, sway-backed mare with a gentle eye. "That's Daisy," he said, his voice making her jump. "She's older than Dust and twice as slow, but she's steady." Lark snatched her hand back, her face flushing. "I'm sorry, I was just—" "You know how to ride?" he cut her off, his question blunt. She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the ground. "No, sir." He was silent for a long moment, looking from her thin frame to the old, placid horse. "A person ought to know how to ride out here," he said finally, as if stating a simple, irrefutable fact of nature. "Meet me here after the noon meal. Silas will saddle her for you." He turned and walked away before she could respond. That afternoon, under the pale, washed-out sky, he taught her to ride. He was not a gentle or patient teacher. His instructions were terse, barked-out commands. Sit up straight, heels down. Don't pull on her mouth like that. He rode his own powerful gray, Asher, circling her as she and Daisy made slow, wobbly circuits of the corral. Lark was terrified at first. The height, the unfamiliar movement, the sheer size of the animal beneath her, it was all overwhelming. But Jericho's brusque, impersonal instructions were a strange comfort. He wasn't coddling her. He was teaching her a skill, a tool for survival. Slowly, her fear gave way to a fragile confidence. She learned the rhythm of the horse's walk, the feel of the reins in her hands. By the end of the hour, she was guiding Daisy around the corral on her own, a small, tentative smile once again gracing her lips. For the first time, she felt a sense of control, a feeling of freedom that was so new and intoxicating it almost made her dizzy. Jericho watched her, his expression unreadable, and then, with a curt nod, he simply said, "That's enough for today," and rode off. The lessons continued, an unspoken addition to their daily routine, and with the lessons came another change. One morning, he rode out to the south pasture to check a section of fence that had been damaged in a windstorm. He found her waiting for him by the gate, mounted on Daisy, a pair of wire cutters and a hammer resting in a sack tied to her saddle. She didn't say a word, just looked at him with a quiet, questioning gaze. He stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of something annoyance, surprise crossing his features. Then, without a word, he turned his horse and led the way. They worked together all morning under the vast, silent sky. The work was hard and repetitive. They pulled the old, rusted wire, drove new posts into the unforgiving earth, and stretched the new wire until it sang with tension. The dialogue between them was sparse, functional, and stripped to its bare essentials. Hold this post. The hammer. Pull. But the silence between the words was filled with a new kind of communication. It was the shared rhythm of their labor, the easy way they learned to anticipate each other's movements. It was the simple, profound intimacy of two people working together to mend something that was broken. He would drive a post, his powerful shoulders bunching with the effort, and she would be there to hand him the next staple. She would struggle to cut a thick piece of wire, her thin wrists straining, and he would take the cutters from her without a word and snip it with a single, effortless squeeze. They were building more than a fence. They were, strand by strand, building a fragile, unspoken trust. The vast, empty space that had separated them was slowly being filled, not with words, but with shared work, with quiet lessons, with the simple fact of being present in each other's lives. The peace was real, a quiet, growing thing that Lark had begun to believe might actually last. The illusion was shattered on a Tuesday. A rider appeared on the horizon, a lone, dark speck in the shimmering heat haze. It was not an uncommon sight, but this rider moved with a purpose that set Lark's nerves on edge. He rode straight for the ranch house, his horse moving at a steady, ground-eating trot. It was Marshal Colton, the lawman from Redemption. He was a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He dismounted, his spurs jingling a solemn, metallic tune, and met Jericho on the porch. Lark was inside the kitchen, her hands submerged in a bowl of dough. She could see their shapes through the screen door. Two tall, silent men outlined against the bright, unforgiving glare of the afternoon. She could not hear their words, only the low, serious murmur of their voices, but she could read the tension in their bodies. She saw the way the marshal shifted his weight from foot to foot, the way Jericho stood unnaturally still, his arms crossed over his chest, a statue carved from granite. The wind shifted, and a few words drifted through the screen door, sharp and clear. Asking questions in town about a woman matches her description. Lark's hands froze in the dough, a cold dread, sharp and sudden as a shard of ice, pierced through the warm, peaceful bubble she had been living in. The marshal's voice dropped lower again, but then Jericho's response came, clear and hard as a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. What name is he using? There was a pause. The wind sighed around the corners of the house. The windmill kept up its endless, mournful complaint. Then the marshal spoke a name, two simple words that struck Lark with the force of a physical blow. Clyde McGrath. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs, and the sunny kitchen suddenly felt cold and dark. Clyde McGrath. The name was a key, unlocking a door in her mind that she had kept bolted and barred for months. Behind that door was a flood of memories she had fought every day to keep at bay: the smell of whiskey, the sound of a wheedling, persuasive voice that could turn to gravelly menace in a heartbeat, the terrifying, unpredictable flash of violence in a pair of laughing blue eyes. The ghost she had been running from for 1,000 miles suddenly had a name, and he was here. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. The strength went out of her legs, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The dough on her hands felt like a cold, dead weight. On the porch, Jericho saw the change in her through the screen. He saw her face go slack with terror, saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped the table. His own face, already hard, seemed to turn to stone. Marshal Colton cleared his throat. Heard he was headed this way. Just thought you should know. A man like that, he's trouble. Jericho did not take his eyes off of Lark. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and cold and absolute. It was a vow, a declaration of war made in a voice as quiet as a prayer. She's safe here. The marshal nodded, understanding the finality in those 3 words. He tipped his hat. Just the same, you watch your back. Kane. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. Jericho stood on the porch for a long time, watching the marshal disappear back into the vast, indifferent landscape. He was no longer looking at Lark. He was looking outward, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he could see the storm that was coming. The peaceful days were over. The wind was picking up, no longer a soft whisper, but a low, menacing moan that rattled the windows and spoke of a violence that was gathering just out of sight. The ghost had returned, and the fragile peace they had built was about to be tested by fire. The peace, once broken, could not be easily mended. The marshal's visit had left a crack in the foundation of Lark's fragile new world, and through that crack, the cold wind of her past began to blow. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress, and she was its prisoner. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. The name Clyde McGraw was a constant, unspoken presence, a ghost that sat at the dinner table and watched her from the dark corners of the kitchen. Days passed, each one stretching her nerves thinner. She grew gaunt, the faint smile she had found completely erased, replaced by the old, hunted look in her eyes. She stopped her riding lessons with Daisy. The feeling of freedom had been a lie, a brief, foolish dream. There was no freedom, not while he was out there. Jericho watched her deterioration in his usual grim silence. He did not offer words of comfort. It was not his way. But she would find a fresh pot of coffee brewed when she came into the kitchen in the morning, a task he had never undertaken before. He left a stack of old newspapers and a dime novel on the kitchen table, a silent offering against the long, terrifying nights. They were small, rough gestures of a man who spoke a language of action. Not emotion, but they were a language she was beginning to understand. The inevitable came a week later. The salt pork was gone, and the cornmeal was low. A trip to redemption was necessary. "No," she said, the word a small, sharp sound of panic when he told her. She was standing by the stove, and her hands, which had been steady for weeks, began to tremble. "I can't. The supplies won't walk here on their own," he stated, his voice flat. "Send Silas, or go yourself. Please, don't make me go." He looked at her for a long moment, his pale eyes taking in her stark white face and the sheer terror in her eyes. A muscle worked in his jaw. "He won't show himself in broad daylight, and you'll be with me. Get your bonnet." His words were final, an iron door slamming shut on any further argument. To him, it was a simple calculation of risk and necessity. To her, it felt like a death sentence. The journey into town was a silent agony. Every rider they passed on the track, every distant shape on the horizon, was him. By the time they reached the main street of Redemption, Lark felt physically ill. A cold knot of dread clenched in her stomach. The town, which had once seemed merely loud and chaotic, now felt predatory, filled with 1,000 unseen threats. Jericho pulled the wagon up in front of the mercantile. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low. It was the only acknowledgement he gave of the danger. She practically clung to his shadow as they moved through the town, her eyes darting nervously from face to face in the crowd. She was so focused on her fear, she didn't see him until it was too late. Jericho had stepped into the hardware store to buy fence staples, leaving her for a moment by the mercantile's horse trough. And that's when she heard the voice, a voice she had prayed every night she would never hear again. "Well now, ain't you a sight for sore eyes?" The voice was just as she remembered it, smooth as fresh cream, with a lazy, confident drawl that was designed to charm and disarm. But underneath the smoothness was a sound like razors being sharpened, a chilling edge of menace that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She froze, her entire body locking up. Slowly, she forced herself to turn. Clyde McGraw stood not 10 feet away, leaning against a porch post as if he owned it. He hadn't changed. He was handsome in a way that was too polished, too perfect for this dusty, hardscrabble world. His dark hair was oiled and combed, his clothes were clean, and his smile was a flash of brilliant white in his tanned face. But his eyes were the same. They were a pale, cold blue, and they held no warmth at all. They were the eyes of a wolf, watching, calculating. He pushed himself off the post and took a slow step toward her. "I've been asking after you, Lark, wondering where my favorite girl got off to." Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Her mind was a white-hot blank of pure terror. He took another step, his smile widening, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Left in such a hurry, didn't even say goodbye." "That ain't polite." He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could smell the faint, sickening scent of bay rum and whiskey on him. "Ain't you a sight?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You and me got history." The word history was a loaded gun pointed at her head. It was a history of bruises that faded and fears that didn't, a history of her running and him always, eventually, finding her. "Now, Clyde McGray, you leave that little thing alone. Can't you see you're scaring her half to death?" The voice was sharp, loud, and startlingly familiar. Lark tore her eyes away from Clyde to see Ruby Belmont standing on the boardwalk, hands on her hips, her painted face a mask of indignation. For once, her sharp tongue was a shield, not a weapon. Clyde's smile tightened. "Ruby, always a pleasure. This is a private conversation." "Doesn't look private to me," Ruby shot back, her voice carrying down the street. "Looks to me like you're bothering Jericho Kane's cook, and I hear Kane don't take kindly to people bothering his property." The mention of Jericho's name made Clyde pause. A flicker of something caution, perhaps, crossed his face. He had built his life on preying on the weak and unprotected. Jericho Kane was neither of those things. The hesitation was all the opening Lark needed. The spell of her paralysis broke. With a strangled sob, she turned and fled. She didn't look back. She scrambled onto the wagon, her hands fumbling with the reins, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Jericho came out of the hardware store then, his face like a thundercloud. He had heard Ruby's voice. He saw Lark on the wagon, her face a mask of terror. He saw Clyde McGraw standing on the boardwalk, his charming smile now a venomous sneer. Their eyes met across the dusty street, a silent declaration of war passing between them. Then Jericho moved, not with haste, but with a terrible, deliberate purpose. He swung up onto the wagon bench, took the reins from Lark's trembling hands, and with a sharp snap, sent the horses lunging forward. They left redemption in a cloud of dust and desperation. Lark huddled on the bench, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking uncontrollably. She didn't speak until the last of the town's buildings had disappeared behind them. Then the story came tumbling out of her, a frantic, broken torrent of words. It was him, Clyde. He was there. He said we had history. He touched my arm once, and... She trailed off, unable to articulate the horrors that the simple name conjured. She told him everything, the fear and the running and the certainty that he would never, ever stop. Jericho listened. He did not interrupt. He just let her talk, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands holding the reins in a white-knuckled grip. The horses, sensing his urgency, ran at a punishing pace, their hooves drumming a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. When they finally reached the ranch, he pulled the wagon to a halt in the yard and just sat there, the lines of his face carved into an expression of grim finality. Lark had fallen silent, her story spent, leaving only the ragged sound of her breathing in the sudden quiet. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading question. What now? What would he do? Would he send her away? Tell her she was too much trouble. He was silent for a very long time. The wind whispered through the dry grass. The windmill moaned its lonely song. He seemed to be looking at something far away, something only he could see. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were clear and hard, and in their depths, she saw a promise. "You're safe here," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of an anvil. It was not a hope. It was a statement of absolute, immovable fact. It was the sound of a good man drawing a line in the sand. That night, the ranch was locked in a tense, waiting silence. Lark could not eat. She could not rest. She sat at the kitchen table, the lantern casting a solitary pool of light on the scarred wood. She tried to busy her hands, polishing the same tin spoons over and over, but they trembled so badly she kept dropping them with a clatter that echoed the frantic beating of her own heart. She knew Clyde. He was proud. He would not take the humiliation of her running, of being challenged in public. Lying down, he would come. The thought was a certainty, a cold, hard stone in the pit of her stomach. The safety Jericho had promised felt as fragile as a pane of glass. She could hear him moving in the main room of the house. There was no conversation, no sound of the newspaper pages he sometimes read. There was only a series of small, sharp, metallic sounds. A click, a soft, oiled whisper, a snap. Curiosity, stronger than her fear, finally propelled her to her feet. She crept to the kitchen door and peered into the shadowed main room. Jericho was sitting in a chair, his back to her, the lantern from the table beside him casting his broad shoulders in sharp relief. On the table in front of him lay the pieces of his Winchester rifle. He was cleaning it. She watched, mesmerized by the slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm movements of his hands. He worked with a practiced, focused economy, wiping down the barrel with an oiled cloth, checking the firing mechanism, seating each brass cartridge one by one into the magazine. Each metallic click was a punctuation mark in the silent, deadly conversation he was having with himself. This was his answer to Clyde McGraw. This was the true shape of his promise. He was not a man of many words, but his actions spoke a language of absolute, lethal clarity. She backed away from the door, her heart a cold, heavy lump in her chest. She returned to the kitchen table and sat down, her hands finally still in her lap. He was cleaning his gun. The ghost was no longer a phantom from her past. He was real, he was close, and a man of iron was preparing to meet him. The storm had arrived. The sky had been a bruised, sickly yellow all afternoon. The air, thick and heavy, refused to move, and an unnatural silence had fallen over the plains, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The ranch hands, sensing the change, had finished their work early, securing the livestock in the barn and casting anxious glances at the horizon. By late afternoon, the first gust of wind hit the ranch, a violent, explosive force that rattled the windows in their frames and sent a tidal wave of dust scouring the yard. Then came the rain. It did not start as a drizzle, but as a deluge, a solid, gray sheet of water that hammered the tin roof of the house with a deafening roar. The world outside the windows dissolved into a churning, watery chaos. Jagged forks of lightning tore the dark clouds asunder, followed an instant later by cracks of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Lark stood in the kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the storm unleash its fury. Every flash of lightning, every clap of thunder, was a new spike of fear in her already frayed nerves. The storm felt like a manifestation of her own inner turmoil, a violent, external expression of the terror that had been brewing inside her for days. She knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that he would use this storm. He was a creature of chaos and darkness, and this was his element. She was right. Through the maelstrom of wind and rain, she saw him. He was a figure on horseback, emerging from the gray curtain of the downpour like a ghost conjured from the storm itself. He rode slowly, deliberately, into the center of the yard and then simply stopped, his horse standing with its head hung low against the driving rain. He didn't dismount. He didn't seek shelter. He just sat there, a dark, unmovable shape in the heart of the storm, and stared at the house. The kitchen door swung open, and Jericho stepped in, bringing a gust of wind and a spray of cold rain with him. He had his Winchester in his hand, held loosely but ready at his side. He had seen him too. "Stay inside," he said, his voice a low growl that was nearly lost in the roar of the storm. "Lock the door behind me."
"No,"
she whispered, her eyes wide with terror.
"Don't go out there, please."
He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the man in the yard. He came for a conversation. He's going to get one. He stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. He did not stay on the porch. In the relative shelter of the overhang, with a grim, deliberate stride, he walked down the steps and out into the yard, the rain immediately plastering his hair to his head and soaking his shirt. He stopped about 20 feet from Clyde McGraw, the rifle held at a casual, non-threatening angle, but a clear statement nonetheless. The two men faced each other, two unmovable forces in the howling chaos of the storm. Clyde swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and arrogant. A flash of lightning illuminated him for a stark, terrifying instant. The charming smile was gone, replaced by a cold, possessive sneer. He was soaked to the skin, but he seemed not to notice the cold or the rain. "You're a hard man to find, Cain," Clyde shouted over the wind, his voice carrying with an easy confidence. "And you have something that belongs to me." He gestured with his head toward the house, toward the window where he knew Lark was watching. He didn't have a gun in his hand, but the threat was there in his posture, in the cold certainty of his voice. "Came to take what's mine," he said, the words cutting through the howl of the wind. Jericho stood his ground, the rain running in rivulets down his face. He looked at the man who was the source of the shadows in Lark's eyes, the reason for her sleepless nights, and he felt a cold, clean hatred settle over him. "She ain't yours," Jericho replied, his voice flat and hard as stone. The simple, declarative statement was more powerful than any threat. It was an absolute denial, a rejection of Clyde's entire claim. Clyde laughed, a short, ugly sound that was ripped away by the wind. "She is. A man has a right to his property. There are laws about that. You're harboring a runaway." "She ain't property," Jericho said, his grip tightening ever so slightly on the stock of the Winchester. "And the only law that matters out here is the one that says you turn your horse around and ride away from my land." From the kitchen window, Lark watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Jericho standing in the rain for her, a lone bulwark against the storm and the man who had haunted her life. And a new feeling, one she had never felt before, began to burn through the cold fog of her fear. It was a hot, fierce shame, not for what had been done to her, but for hiding, for letting this good, quiet man stand alone in her place. Before she knew what she was doing, she was moving. She unlatched the door and ran out into the storm. The wind tore at her dress, and the cold rain stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. But she didn't stop. She ran past Jericho, her bare feet slipping in the mud, and stopped in the space between the two men. She stood there, trembling from the cold and the fear, but she held her ground. She faced the man who had been the architect of her nightmares. At that moment, 2 more riders materialized from the storm. It was Marshal Colton and one of his deputies, their horses churning the muddy yard. The marshal had his pistol drawn, the metal of it gleaming a dull, deadly gray in the stormlight. "McGray," Colton's voice boomed, a voice used to commanding attention. "I've had enough of your questions and your troublemaking. You're not welcome in my county. Not anymore." Clyde saw the marshal, saw Jericho's unyielding stance, and then he saw Lark. He saw that she was not cowering. She was standing, her chin lifted, her eyes, though filled with fear, blazing with a new and unfamiliar fire. He had lost. He had lost his power, his control. The fear he had so carefully cultivated in her was no longer enough. Lark looked directly at him, at the handsome face that had hidden so much ugliness. She thought of every threat, every moment of pain, every night she had spent listening in terror. And she found her voice. It was not a loud voice, and it trembled, but it carried with an undeniable strength over the roar of the storm. It was the sound of chains breaking. "You don't own me," she said. The 3 words, spoken into the heart of the storm, changed everything. They were a declaration, an emancipation. They were the truest words she had ever spoken. Clyde stared at her, his face twisting into a mask of pure, venomous rage. The charming facade was gone, revealing the petty, cruel tyrant beneath. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He had no more moves to make. He turned without another word, swung himself onto his horse, his movements jerky with anger. He wheeled the animal around, his eyes locking onto Lark one last time. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice a raw promise of future violence. Then he spurred his horse and galloped away, disappearing back into the gray, weeping curtain of the storm. He was gone, leaving behind only the cold rain and the ugly echo of his final, bitter curse on the wind. The storm broke just before dawn. The hammering rain softened to a gentle, whispering drizzle, and the wind, having roared itself hoarse, quieted to a soft, mournful sigh. A profound, listening silence fell over the washed-clean world, broken only by the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves of the house and the distant, lonely call of a mourning dove. Lark woke to a world reborn. She had not slept, not really, but had drifted in a state of exhausted, hyper-aware limbo. Yet, when she finally rose from her cot in the first pale, gray light of morning, she felt a strange and unfamiliar lightness. She walked to the small window and looked out. The sky was the color of pearl, streaked with soft pinks and lavenders at the eastern horizon. The air smelled of wet earth, of rain-soaked sagebrush, and of life. The dust that had perpetually coated the world was gone, and every fence post, every blade of grass, every stone in the yard seemed sharper, clearer, defined by a new and startling clarity. The fear was gone. The realization settled over her, not with a rush of relief, but with a quiet, hollowed-out wonder. The cold, hard knot of terror that had lived in her stomach for as long as she could remember had simply dissolved. She probed for it, mentally, expecting to find its familiar, sickening clench. But there was nothing. Only a deep, calm, and profound stillness. Clyde McGraw had come. The ghost had taken flesh, and she had faced him. She had not been struck down. She had not been dragged away. She had stood in the heart of the storm and spoken the truth. And she had survived. She moved into the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She filled the coffee pot with water from the pump, her arm moving with a smooth, steady rhythm. She scooped the dark, fragrant grounds into the basket, and as she worked, she looked at her hands. For the first time in months, perhaps in years, they were not shaking, they were still, and they were her own. The smell of fresh coffee began to fill the quiet house, a warm, comforting aroma that seemed to push back the last of the night's chill. She poured a cup, the hot ceramic a welcome warmth against her palms, and went to sit on the porch steps, pulling a rough wool blanket around her shoulders. She watched the sun crest the horizon, a brilliant, blinding sliver of gold that sent long, hopeful rays of light across the damp, dark earth. The world was being remade before her eyes, and she felt as if she were being remade with it. She did not hear Jericho come up behind her. He moved with a silence that no longer startled her. He simply came to stand in the doorway, a large, solid presence at her back. He, too, had been awake all night, sitting in the dark main room with the Winchester across his lap, listening to the storm die, listening to the silence that followed. He had watched her this morning, had seen the steady hands, the calm in her posture, the way she looked at the sunrise as if seeing it for the first time. He had stood his ground to protect his ranch, his property. That was the cold, hard fact, he told himself. But as he looked at the woman sitting on his steps, her small frame wrapped in a blanket, finding a quiet peace in the aftermath of a battle that had been hers alone to win, he knew it was more than that. He had stood for her, and in doing so, he had defended something inside himself that he had long thought dead. He cleared his throat softly, and she turned to look up at him. Her face, in the soft, golden light of the new day, was scrubbed clean of fear. The weary, haunted lines around her eyes seemed to have softened. "You did good," he said. The words were quiet, rough-edged, but they were filled with a respect that went deeper than any compliment she had ever received. It was an acknowledgement of her courage, a salute from one survivor to another. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. She turned her gaze back to the horizon. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. It was a confession and a declaration all in one. It was the sound of a lifetime's burden being set down. Jericho looked down at the top of her head, at the way the new sunlight caught the stray strands of her hair, turning them to threads of spun gold. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "You don't have to anymore," he said, his voice a low rumble, a promise sealed in the quiet of the morning. "Not here." He went back inside and returned a few moments later with his own mug of coffee. He didn't sit beside her on the steps, but took his usual place in the large wooden chair on the porch, a comfortable distance away. And there they sat, in the quiet of the new morning, as the sun climbed higher into the washed clean sky. They did not speak again. There were no more words that needed to be said. The most important things had already been spoken, in the heart of the storm and in the quiet of the dawn. They sat by the warmth of the kitchen fire later, the porch having grown too bright with the morning sun. The air was filled with the companionable silence of two people who had been to the edge of a cliff together and had not fallen. The only sounds were the soft crackle and pop of the logs in the stove, the gentle sigh of the wind as it whispered through the eaves, and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of an old clock in the main room. This feeling that settled between them was not the fiery, desperate thing that people called love in dime novels. It was not a passion born of stolen glances and fevered whispers. It was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more durable. It was the peace that comes after a long and brutal war. It was the profound, unspoken gratitude of two shipwrecked souls who had washed ashore on the same deserted island and had found, in each other's presence, not a cure for their loneliness, but a way to make the loneliness bearable. It was the feeling of home. The story stops there. It does not need to go on. It ends in that quiet, sunlit kitchen with the smell of coffee and wood smoke in the air. It ends in the comfortable, shared silence between two broken souls who, in standing together against the darkness, had finally found a way to let the light in. They had found, in the vast, empty heart of the West, a stillness that was not empty at all, but full of the unspoken, unwritten, and undeniable promise of a new beginning. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really enjoyed it, Please consider hitting that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.